Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, I'm Richard Naylor, Director of the Colonie Library. My guest today is Professor Mary Valentis. We'll be talking about the William and Henry James Festival or celebration that we're working on, and the next 3 or 4 months will bring us many interesting programs. We want to talk about those and go into the author and the psychologist, I guess I should say, a little bit to get to know them and to wet your whistle a little bit for the upcoming shows. I want to welcome you, Mary, to the show.
Thank you.
First of all, let's talk a little bit about you, what you do. I know you're a literature professor. I know you're director of a center at U Albany. But could you describe that a little bit and give a little background?
Sure, and a sixth-generation resident of the Capital District. So I've been here a long time, and I know the community really well. So that's been an advantage in doing this program. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of Albany, where I teach literature, film, and a lot of psychoanalysis in my literary studies. So.
Perfect, with Henry James.
With Henry James and William James. And I also am a graduate of the Albany Academies, where the grandfather went to school.
So, wow, there are connections on connections.
Lots of connections.
That's nice.
Yeah. I'm also director of the Center for Humanities, Arts, and Technosciences at the university, which is part of the College of Arts and Sciences. And this initiative and center was developed because the humanities are in the process of change. And the humanities have been influenced and infected by science and by technology in such a way that everything is changing, not only the way we teach, the way we think, and the way we relate to other kinds of disciplines.
So that really brings a wide range of topics together here.
I think the Department of English brings together a lot of different kinds of programs and scholars together, because English, everything is migrated in and out of English, whether it's science or whether it's media. And so the humanities, all the humanities, are being enriched by other disciplines.
We could do a whole show on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm going to force myself back on the events that are going to be taking place. Otherwise, I'll get excited and we'll go off on a really interesting discussion. Tell us a little bit about the grant. You and Carol Anderson?
Carol Anderson, my colleague in the library. We wrote a grant and applied to the New York Council for the Humanities about a year ago. And we received one of their major grants, which will enable us to provide programming for the region. And by the region, I'm talking over into Massachusetts and south. And we're bringing a celebration of the James family, particularly William and Henry James, who are associated with this area, and whose family really made the area flourish, and they made their fortune in this area too.
So in a way, I was going to ask you what made you choose William and Henry as part of the grant. You're already answering it a little bit.
Well, we had started out with a Melville symposium a couple of years ago, and we had collaborated with the Albany Institute and the Albany Academies and did an incredible program called Why Melville Matters Now. And we had an academic symposium, we had the aqueduct tour of all the Melville sites, and we had a major show down at the Albany Institute of Frank Stella Melville paintings. And so that went so well as a kind of community collaboration that we decided to look at the rest of the literary history in the area and do something on Henry and William James.
You know, I've always wanted to know as many local authors as possible. And we have a lot of living ones now who are still writing. but many times we think, now, who famous was here? And I didn't realize until shortly before we got involved, and that's just my ignorance, but that the James family was very much from Albany at one point.
Oh yeah, the grandfather, certainly. That's where he made his fortune, which was in real estate, actually. They had a lot of real estate holdings, and then his holdings were also up in Syracuse, and he funded the Erie Canal.
That's not a small enterprise.
No,
there.
not at all. And they were very wealthy, and they had come from England and really had very little money, and then developed this new fortune in the New World. And the James brothers' father, who was a very strange character in many ways.
Henry Sr., right?
Henry Sr. Went to the Albany Academy and attended school there, and then developed a kind of very strange interest in esoteric philosophy. But he educated both boys, and the James family produced these two geniuses, which is very unusual for one family.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I think we could start with Henry a little bit, because Henry's the most well-known, and then move over and look at William a little bit. First of all, let's look at Henry and say, why did you choose him? What's great about him? Any connection to Albany?
Well, again, his connection to Albany is it becomes part of his fictional world. And in the opening of Portrait of a Lady, which is his first major novel, and probably one of the best known aside from Turn of the Screw, Isabel Archer, who is his heroine in that novel, is sitting in her grandmother's house in the back of her grandmother's brownstone on State Street. And but even in a shorter work like Daisy Miller, they're all from Schenectady. And so he plays with Daisy Miller's family from Schenectady and how she goes to Europe, and they talk all about that. So there's this connection with James's fictional imagination and that world. But on the other hand, James is also considered one of the premier American novelists, if not the premier American novelists.
That's a lot to say. So that puts him around Melville.
It puts him up there with Melville. And of course, he's very different, incredibly different from Melville. Melville certainly concentrated on the sea and travel and his journeys, and in many ways he's associated less with Albany, although he did go to the Albany Academy. Also, and lived in Lansingburg as a child. But then his world changes as he goes to the South Seas and then to Nantucket and then out into the South Pacific and Moby Dick. But James's world is more the world of the drawing room, England, Florence, the great houses in England, the wealthy Americans who travel to Europe. And so I would call James a transatlantic novelist.
You almost said
transcendental, yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to Emerson there.
But transatlantic writer. And this is a whole new field that people in my profession are exploring now.
How would you characterize his work? I think many people have the impression that he's difficult. Now, I just started and read a couple works. I read Portrait and finished the Aspirin Papers, and tend to move on because I had such a good time with those. But after I got going in it, the fears went away, because you read horror stories about, well, somebody moves about 2 feet, but it took them 4 pages to make the move between the doorknob and coming into the room. So
well, that's true.
How do you relate to that?
Well, I think what you have to do with Henry James is to really project yourself into James's imaginative worlds and space. And you let yourself go. It's kind of the willing suspension of disbelief. It's the kind of thing that you do when you go into a film and you want to enter that world. And when you do enter that world, every single movement means something. Every single way a character moves across a room, the way he or she gestures, has some kind of meaning, and it usually has what we would call the meaning of body language. And what James does is to infuse his world with emotion, but it's very subtle. And then what happens is that all of a sudden you find yourself getting caught up in this amazing story, because he is a consummate narrator and a consummate storyteller. And his characters become incredibly, you begin with a sketch, and then you get the whole portrait. And that's why Portrait of a Lady is called that, because we get the full portrait in the end of the book.
Yeah, and it does take a while, I think, with Isabel to get that portrait.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
We're wondering why, and what is she going to do, and what choices is she going to make. And most of what we seem to learn about her come from other characters and the narrator.
But finally she learns about herself. And what happens when she learns about herself really is a major shift in American literature and in all literature, because what happens is she becomes the center of her world, and it's her consciousness, it is her imagination that takes center stage in terms of the novel.
Now let's move on to William.
Okay.
Because I think that's the hard part. Maybe there are people that think that Portrait is difficult and some of the other books are difficult, but I've talked to other people who love those books. And so there's a lot of people out there who adore Henry James.
And a lot of movie makers who adore Henry James, too. Lots of filmmakers have made wonderful films, from Washington Square, Daisy Miller, Portrait of a Lady,
on
Turn
and
and
on.
Screw, and on and on.
The Wings of the Dove.
Yeah, yeah.
But William is a little more difficult because, okay, now he's in science, and we're not exactly everyday scientists. Scientists are somebody else normally here. We worry about kids not taking math, especially girls. And so when you want to get involved in somebody who's a scientist, it seems a little difficult, because we're used to reading, it's fun. How do you get involved with William James? Why did you choose him, and how does that work with the grant?
Well, in the grant, our intention was to interface modernism. We really wanted to talk about, the grant is called At the Gateway to Modernism. And what we really wanted to do was to show how, at the beginning of the 20th century, science and the humanities come together. And we thought these two brothers embodied those two really trajectories of the 20th century, which is the psychology of consciousness and emotion and the self, and the novel of consciousness and emotion and the self. And these two brothers really form that kind of trellis over the 20th century.
I think when I started working with you on the grant, of course I didn't know much about either one. We had done a multi-part program last year on Edith Wharton, and I grew to really love her and was so thankful that I had read her. And now on this one, the same thing's happening. I'm learning things that I didn't know before. And in terms of William James, I really didn't understand or realize, and I guess we know this kind of in general, but when you find something specific to someone and it becomes more real, that psychology didn't exactly exist when he started. Is it philosophy? Is it religion? Is it psychology?
Education.
Is it education? What are we really talking about?
Right.
So you're saying that it really was almost in the humanities back then.
Psychology was almost in the humanities, but of course, you know, he comes right after or right at the same time as Freud. And so while Freud is creating his circle in Vienna, William James is beginning to become the father of American psychology. And that whole history of American psychology is quite distinct from European psychology. And William James really invents the whole school of cognitive psychology, and he's very interested in the emotions, but he still blends it with philosophy. That discipline of psychology, he sort of carves that out while he's at Harvard. He also carves out the whole school of education at Harvard. And so what he does is essentially split this whole field into education and psychology. And then, of course, he was interested very much in what we call the realm of the paranormal or psychic phenomenon. And of course, Freud, too, said that if he were going to come back he would come back and study the paranormal, which is ghosts and telepathy and precognition, all those things that everybody is sort of fascinated by. And he was even the president of the American Psychical Society.
And back then there were a lot of people who were doing seances, correct? And,
oh, yeah.
And groups of people who would try to contact their forebears or their relatives?
Yeah, and William James was part of these seances and encouraged that kind of mediumship. I guess that's what you call it. You know, because
it's a new word to me. But
we have mediums now. I mean, seances go on all over. And it's that desire to be in contact with someone who's passed.
So now we have these two people, and they both seem like psychologists. You made a statement to me once, and I have a hard time with it, but I'm going to ask you to explain it.
Yeah.
You said that it has been said that William James is the writer.
Or the novelist.
Or the novelist,
yes.
Thank you. And that Henry James was the psychologist.
William James was very prolific, and he wrote very lucidly and clearly because he talked about, he wrote about the psychology of the human mind, human behavior, and he was much more clear. James was much more interested in what we now call the intrapsychic life, the inner life of the human being. And that's what he was trying to represent in his novels, was the inner life of the human being. And that is what is so fascinating. Because even in a novel like Portrait of a Lady, we see what happens when a woman wants to be free, but because of certain kinds of psychological issues that she has, cannot escape her fate. And that fate is determined by her emotional development.
Right, not just society, because she made choices.
Absolutely.
At least we think she made choices.
Yes, and so this whole idea of her being an agent of her own fate, I mean, she can make these decisions, and that's what's so fascinating, and why James's novels are so contemporary. But the other piece to this Henry James, the psychologist, and William, the novelist, is I think William's interest in the paranormal helped Henry James, his brother, write about the turn of the screw, because Henry James too was fascinated in ghosts.
Now, did Henry? I know that William read Henry, but had a hard time with it and said, "Why don't you write simpler?"
Right.
But did Henry read William?
That I don't know whether he read him. I'm sure he read him. I think he read his, some of his essays. But they interface, and they really form a very interesting story about that family, because that family's interesting too. William James himself suffered from, I guess you could call it major depression, bouts of major depression. And when he goes to Africa and he goes and travels, he's very homesick, but he also suffers from a kind of deep sadness, and they worry about him. Although he does, live a long life and he functions very well, but he had a lot of, I wouldn't say personality disorders, but intrapsychic battles with himself.
Yes, I remember reading, and I want to go into this a little bit, a book by Linda Simon, professor from Skidmore, who wrote a fantastic book, a biography of William James. I went back and looked at some of the reviews in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. They were all glowing over the book. And we're delighted that in April she'll be at the Colonie Library to talk about that book. Well, reading it, I think part of the reason that the book is so intriguing and engaging is that you not only find events, because there are some events, but you really go into the character both from his psychological struggles, his family relationships, and his science. And the science is certainly not less interesting than the rest.
And a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists enter that profession, not all of them, because they're trying to deal with their own lives and
yeah, we don't want to paint them all that way.
No, we don't want to. No, but that is the course for some.
And to be fair to them, I think every human being deals with these problems, and so some of us want to know more about ourselves, and it's so natural.
Sure, absolutely.
So, okay, we've got these two characters. Let's talk a little bit about the programming that we're going to be doing over the next March, April, May, and even June.
And
4
even
months.
into June, yes. Well, our next major program is called Henry James on Stage. And that will be an afternoon and evening. The first starts out with a workshop by Dr. Barbara Blattner from Yeshiva University, who is going to do a workshop for writers who are interested in adapting Henry James short stories for poetry or for the stage. And that will be followed by a writers' networking buffet dinner, which is free and open to the public. And then that evening, R.L. Lane, who adapted Bartleby, Melville's Bartleby for the stage, will be directing and present for a stage reading of his new play, which is inspired, he says, by the Aspirin Papers, which is one of Henry James' novellas.
I'll be really curious to find out how close that is, how closely that follows the book.
He said that it's set in a contemporary environment, but
so no gondola.
Right. But he's very interested in the characters, and he did. His Bartleby got tremendous reviews from the New York Times.
So this is really almost a happening here at UAlbany.
Yes, it is, and we hope.
What's the date again?
It's March 4th. And
so that's the closest one.
That's the closest one, and that starts at 3 o'clock with a workshop, and then the stage reading is from 7 to 9, and then after the stage reading is a talk back with the playwright.
That should be fun.
Yeah, he'll be there to answer questions about writing, about what it is to cast a reading, and there'll be New York actors coming up from the city.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It might be a good time to interject that rather than try to remember all the programs that we talk about, there's a website, as well as brochures in many of the local public libraries about all these programs.
The central place for information is our website, which is www.jamesfamilycelebration.com.
And we'll put that up on the screen so people can see how that all spells out.
Yes. But one of the more exciting events is a Henry James Film Festival. And we are in negotiations, let's say, to perhaps have a celebrity or two come to Albany, and we're going to be screening Henry James' Daisy Miller.
That should be exciting.
Yeah.
And where's that going to be?
That's going to be at the Linda. We're collaborating with WAMC on a sort of day and a half evening gala and then half-day film festival. And so stay tuned for that one.
And for anybody who hasn't been to the Linda, which would include me, because we had a meeting at one of the Linda's or AMC offices, and I had passed by this building many times, and I've listened to many interviews of Alan Chartock and many other people on AMC, and not seen the building. And it sits right there on, Ontario and Central Avenue?
And Central Avenue, and there's a lot of parking too. So, and it's a nice space. We, the university and actually our Center for Humanities did a major semester program, just like this one, on architecture. We had, William Kennedy and I did a program on architecture and film, and looked at all the local buildings.
Oh, wow.
In Albany, and how they have been portrayed in film. So
that sounds very interesting, and there'll be a lot of films.
Quite a few films, and we'll also have experts who can talk about the films.
So a lot of fun for film buffs.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Then the other thing we have prepared are we have a couple of tours. We have a walkabout of some houses on State Street and Elk Street where the James family lived, and where there were certain incidents.
And how about Isabel's house?
And Isabel Archer's house on State Street. So that's a walkabout, but we also have two other tours that are going to be done by the Aqueduct tour, actually trolley tours. Where people can get on the trolley and take one tour around the James Literary and Albany Academy Circle, and then the other tour is the Erie Canal, and where the grandfather was operative.
And those will be limited, so we really urge people to
make their
sign up,
reservations.
right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then the other tour we have is a tour of the James family plot and related sites at the Albany Rural Cemetery.
So we will tie them very closely to Albany there.
Yes, and there'll be a brunch first, and then we'll walk to the cemetery to find the Jameses.
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, and then I think we have another event, which is Henry James Till You Drop, or something like that, where we look
Yes.
at other films, and that will be held at the Albany Academy on Academy Road, and those are some very exciting films. And then, of course, we have all this community, our community reading these texts of Henry James
And William.
and William James. Yeah, the varieties of a religious experience, Portrait of a Lady, and Turn of a Screw, and watching the films and talking about the films too.
And then with William James, we have 2 William James programs at this library in April. One, I think on the 7th of April, Linda Simon will come and talk about the book. We mentioned that. And on the 27th, we'll have a led discussion about pragmatism, one of William James' works. And in trying to decide what of William James we should talk about, I had a hard time. We talk about the principles of psychology, but this is either a 3-volume work or a small work, and what do you read out of that? But he did lectures, and from her book, I learned how wonderful a lecturer he was. He would fill large auditoriums of people wanting to hear him. And so he wrote these lectures in book form, and pragmatism is one of those. So it's very readable, and it's such a big part of American philosophical and psychological history.
Yeah. It's a strain that is not as popular now, but it really influenced the 20th century of American psychology.
And even though it's not popular now, having read it, I have to say I learned things.
Oh, sure.
And it clarified my thinking about things, which doesn't always happen when you read philosophy of someone who wrote it 50 or 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's see. We also have some films at different libraries. So I believe there are 9 public libraries involved in the grant, as well as some of the other organizations. And
yeah.
That really makes it a nice community event.
Well, we also have collaboration with the Albany Institute, who is helping us with a program that we're going to be doing at the old Academy building downtown, where Henry James Sr. went to school.
And that's near the courthouse?
Yes, right.
So it seems like when I imagine a building like that, it's somewhere isolated. And yet, I guess we know that it's right now. It's built all around.
Yeah.
But it's still got a tremendous amount of history, and
it's being used by the Albany Public School System.
And I've looked at it, wondering what is that. So we're going to find out not only what it is, but how it's connected to the James family. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun.
So all in all, we've got a lot going on.
Tremendous amount, and we invite everybody to come to all the different programs.
So one more time, I guess, the website.
www.jamesfamilycelebration.com.
And I guess that's all we want to say about that.
Thank you.
I really want to thank you for being on the show, and I look forward to working with you and all the other fine people who are putting this together. It's such a privilege, and I guess really just fun.
It's a lot of fun, and I think everybody who comes to these programs will not only learn a lot, but really have enjoy all the programs too. So.
I'm always impressed, to get one last word in, of how many intelligent people we have in the community. You know, we walk around every day and we all look like normal people, and yet you don't know what's inside of another person. And then you sit down with a book discussion with them, and you learn things. That's one of the most fun things to me.
That's the joy of teaching too. I mean, that's what you learn in the classroom too, especially in a writing class or a James class or whatever. It's all about the unfolding of the human heart. And I think that's what both James are about.
Love it, thank you.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed our chat, that you check out some of these programs coming up and that I see you at some of them and we get to know each other. Have a great week. Take care.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.